In his wonderful book on the preacher and preaching, St. Francis de Sales said that the most important thing in preaching was to have method, method above all. When he was speaking about method, he wasn't speaking about a method of preparing the homily. He was speaking about a method of organizing the homily, of structuring the homily. And in that book, he gives many methods that he uses for his own preaching. And any modern preacher reading, it's a collection of letters on the preacher and preaching, will find very useful methods there. But there are many other methods available to modern preachers today. One of the most useful, one of the most fruitful, is something called inductive preaching. Now, inductive preaching was championed by Fred Craddock, one of the founders and promoters of the new homiletic movement starting in the 1970s. In particular, his book has One Without Authority. That method of preaching draws its name from the discipline of logic. And the idea is, and calling it inductive, is that rather than presenting your main message up front, rather making a declaration and then proving it, that this kind of homily, the inductive homily, moves from part to part, from piece to piece, from item to item, and gradually leading to the conclusion, the message, which comes later in the homily. And that's why this method has sometimes been called narrative preaching. The term narrative preaching has been understood by some people so that they imagine that narrative preaching is all about telling stories. But although you can certainly tell stories in your homilies, this is not why the inductive preaching method is called narrative preaching. It is called narrative preaching because the homily is to be structured like a narrative, like a plot, like a story, which often starts with an exposition, has an event, gradually leads up and builds to a climax. Perhaps the easiest way to compare this, or to make this clear, would be to compare this to a murder mystery. So at the beginning of a murder mystery novel, there are events that happen, there's an exposition, and then there's the event of the murder itself. And then from that moment on, the great detective is gradually gathering clues, and then finally, when we get to the climax, the great detective Hercule Poirot, for example, is in the drawing room with all the suspects, and he connects all the clues together, and out of it comes the great reveal. This is how narrative preaching works. One of the most useful approaches for this is the work of Eugene Lowry in his wonderful book, The Homiletical Plot. And Eugene Lowry develops a method sometimes called the Lowry loop, which is an explanation of the narrative method, the plotted method of the homily. So he will start with something that upsets the apple cart. It may be a difficult line in the homily, that in the readings of that mass, which disturbs people, or it may be an event which seems puzzling, or it may be a question that people are bringing to those particular readings. So he starts directly with that, rather than avoiding them, rather than going on to something else. And then he then explores that. So we have the laying out of the situation, it's the murder. We have now exploration. And the exploration would be, how have different people thought about that? Maybe early church fathers, different theologians, or different people in the modern world. How do they interpret that? What are the possible reasons for that? And then at some point, you might get to that none of these answers really satisfy. And then in the Lowry loop, the homilist then reveals the hint, the clue, the main clue that comes out of the readings, especially for Catholic preachings, the other readings of that Mass, so that, as the homiletic directory says, the readings are mutually revelatory, or perhaps from the liturgical text. Maybe there might be something in the antiphon or the collect that maybe doesn't answer the question 100%, but points us in the right direction, gives us a glimmer of an answer. And after that happens in the Lowry loop, then the preacher unfolds that fully in the gospel, show how that fits in to the faith, to the Christian faith, in our case, to the Catholic Christian faith, and its whole context, and the implications for living that out. So how would that work practically? Well, let's take an example. In the second Sunday of Lent in year B, we have that first reading from Genesis of Abraham being called to sacrifice his own son. And we have that horrible image of Isaac being tied up, and there's Abraham there with a knife right over top of him. And that's a problem for pretty well anyone who hears that. The problem might be phrased for some people, how could God ever ask that of anybody? The problem might be for somebody else, how could a father ever do that to his own child? And that's a question that a parent might be asking. Or the question might be coming from younger people, you know, how could parents do that to their own children? And how could this be sanctioned by God? So he raises, that problem would be raised up right at the beginning. Then you would explore the possibilities. Well, there are some writers, some thinkers, some theologians have said, well, this was God's testing. Other people will say, well, God is omniscient. He knows the answer. He knows Abraham's heart, so there's no need for him to give him a test. But really what it was an event to show Abraham to himself the depths of his faith. And then there are other explanations that that people will have. And the preacher can go through these and then at some point say, but this doesn't fully satisfy, this doesn't really take away the horror that we have, or the dismay that we have, how incredulous this can all be. And then the preacher finds a clue somewhere else in the readings. Now, in that set of readings for the second Sunday of Advent in year B, the gospel reading is the Transfiguration. And there is that moment where the voice speaks from the cloud saying, this is my son. And it is the son who is on the way to Jerusalem to be crucified. And in that moment, we see here is a God who has not exempted himself from the horror that we see in that Genesis reading. In fact, we are meant to be disturbed by it. We are meant to see it as a great horror, because then we realize the depths of what God has called his own son to do. But more than that, with our Catholic faith and our understanding, we also realize that God, as the second person of the Trinity, is the one who is going to be sacrificed, the one who accepts to be tied up on that wood and pierced with a lance rather than a knife. And so in that moment, we don't entirely get the whole picture, but we get an idea that what that image shows was how awful and horrific and what extents our God has gone to for us. And in fact, this is what Lent is all about. It is a whole preparation for that crucifixion, is that whole preparation for that act of redemption, that whole preparation for the worst moment that ever happened, which becomes the best moment that ever happened. So that it is no longer, as in many religions in the ancient world where they had sacrifice of children, young children, and it's recorded in scripture, in the Old Testament, the other nations and other religions were doing this. It is no longer that the people are sacrificing their children, but that God does redemption himself. This doesn't give us a complete answer. This doesn't tie up everything with a bow. And in fact, we should be very wary of any answers which tie up everything with a bow and give complete answers. I don't understand how my computer works or how my car works, except for general principles. How do I understand the redemption of God? And yet it does give us a glimpse of what that event was actually pointing to and was teaching us. When we do these things, we are using a method which is particularly suitable for problematic readings, difficult questions, which shows the congregation that they are not being avoided. And in fact, when the congregation hears a scripture and this question or difficult thought, why would God say this? Why would God do this? Why would Jesus require this kind of life from us? When those difficult questions come up, they then become the focus of the homily. They become the opening event from which the preacher leads the congregation through an unfolding of the clues, taking them through almost the same journey that he went through, so that they are traveling that journey together until they get the glimmer. Now we see through a glass darkly. This is as close as we're going to get. But the homily recognizes that, respects the question of the listener, and brings them to the message which is then revealed at the end of the homily.